Welcome to episode 438 of the Reformed Brotherhood. I'm Jesse.
And I'm Tony, and this is the podcast of Brotherly Love. Hey, brother.
Hey, brother. I think on this conversation, we're going to get into some shadows, some light. We're going through Colossians, so everybody should come hang out with us there. But isn't it amazing how, as we've gone through this, we could find titles for all these episodes by just syncing them up with the verses. But everywhere we go, we just find the gospel, and we find Jesus, of course, at the center of that gospel. So there are maybe like better titles, but now it's just like, it's the Jesus podcast. We're just going to talk about how great Jesus is, all the things he's doing, all the things that he does to revolutionize what it means to be humankind, restoring all the things. I don't know, can we just put in a bunch of episodes? You choose your own title for the next 6, 7, 8, 10 episodes, whatever you want. But we're going to get there, and we're still hanging out in chapter 2. But I think we're going to be talking about legalists and legalism, about shadows, and about the real thing, and maybe some other stuff as well.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I'm excited to get into it. We'll have to go backwards a little bit in the passage because we want to just touch base quickly on something that came up earlier in the passage that we didn't really touch on. But we're moving forward. We're getting going.
Forward.
I think we're going to finish chapter 2 today, and then we'll be on to chapter 3 next week. So if you haven't been following along, go back and listen because Colossians, like all of Paul's letter, is an argument that's being made, and it builds on itself, and it refers back to things earlier. So you're welcome to just like parachute into where we are. But if you've got time and you have the gumption, go back and listen to the rest of the Colossians episodes and get caught up, and it'll be great. I'm super excited.
We're like sharks. We don't swim backwards. We only move forwards. And to that end, what are you affirming with you? What are you denying against?
I'm denying today, it's hard to phrase this exactly. So there's a video going around of John Piper. I don't know if you've seen it or not. Probably not, because you're not on social media. He was preaching or teaching at something called the Coram Deo conference. And he gave a sermon or a lecture, whatever it was. And it's been very polarizing, which is typical with John Piper sermons. It's not the sermon necessarily that I'm denying. It's this propensity in our modern culture, particularly in sort of the reformed blogosphere, onlineosphere. And I've certainly fallen into this in the past, so there's no like huge judgment coming, but this tendency to critique sound bites rather than critique the whole content of something.
Sure.
So, and I mean that like the immediate content. So in this case, it would be the entire lecture, but then also like in the context of his broader theology as well. So there are two camps. Piper was explaining part of Hebrews chapter 3, one of the warning passages, and he more or less articulated that these are warnings for Christians, which is a view that is within the pale of orthodoxy and within the pale of Reformed orthodoxy, that the warning passages are warnings for Christians. They're real, genuine warnings, and that those who are within the visible church can separate themselves from Christ by failing to believe and failing to finish the race, right? Nothing controversial, or shouldn't be anything controversial about that.
Right.
But what quickly came about is there are those who were looking at it and just flat out saying like, this is terrible. This is legalism. This is awful. How dare you tell a Christian they might not be saved? And then there was the other side that was like, this is perfect. It's totally fine. It's just John Piper. It's just Reformed theology. The simple answer is it's probably not just Reformed theology because it's John Piper, and John Piper doesn't represent classic confessional Reformed theology. But in the context of this clip, none of the words that he said violates any specific Reformed principle. But the problem is that within the broader sermon itself, there are some questionable statements that he makes about how the word sustains people in the faith. Well, that's fine, I guess. But when you then back out even further into John Piper's broader theology, and I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not too much tongue-in-cheek, John Piper teaches something that I call justification sola feels. And what I mean by that is he's articulated in long published form that there's what he calls an affectional element to the faith. And so he would argue it's very similar to lordship salvation. And so the critique is very similar to lordship salvation, that affectional, emotive elements of what it means to treasure Jesus, to love Jesus, to be enamored with Jesus, that those are component parts of what faith is, the same way or similar to how John MacArthur argues that repentance and obedience are component parts of faith. So it sort of forces its way into the instrumental means of grace or in the instrumental means of salvation, that you have to feel it. You have to have the emotions back it up. And if you don't have the emotions, it's cause to question your salvation. And so the reason that that's relevant is when we look at a sermon like this, or we look at a sound clip like this, we have to consider it in the broader context of a person's theology. The words that he was saying were not overtly controversial. I don't have any issues with the actual like words on paper. Many places he's just quoting parts of Hebrews. The problem with that, and I said this to someone on Twitter, is that Arius also quoted parts of Colossians, right? Arius was quoting that Christ is the firstborn over all creation, the same way that Athanasius was. So it's not necessarily what the words that they say are; it's what they mean by those words. So I haven't done a deep dive on this sermon. We don't need to get into it. But what I'm denying is this idea that we can abstract tiny portions of what someone says and analyze them on their own merits without any reference to the surrounding context or the broader surrounding context of a person's corpus of work and their life. We just can't do that, and we shouldn't do that. And we've been taught kind of by the way that social media clips are passed around that you can just abstract that. It's not legit. Like, it's not fair to do that to anybody's work. We wouldn't like it if someone did it to our work, and it's not how we read the Bible. It's not how we read any other book, right? We don't read a portion of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and then think it has meaning apart from the rest of the story. We just don't do that. But then we'll do that sometimes with the Bible, and then we'll do that sometimes with just like a sound clip or a tiny section of someone's article online. We just tear that one thing apart without looking at the rest of it. So I'm denying sound clip theology, I guess. That's what you might want to call it. Just think we need to get better at like zooming out and looking at the whole picture.
That's fair. I like that. I think we've talked about this somewhat before, and maybe we need to come up with a list of how we might practically apply charitability in evaluating online theological positions, sound bites, clips, tweets, or X's. I don't know. What do we call them? Are they still tweets, even though it's on X?
I think they're still tweets.
That's super confusing.
It is very confusing.
So, but I really take your point, and I think that that's really good. Is there's just a tendency to take everything in that 30-second soundbite and not only try to evaluate it, but pretend as if like that is the whole and the summation of all the parts. And I like what you said. We don't like that when that happens to us, even in conversation. You know what I mean? Like you could be talking to somebody, having a robust dialogue, and they're repeating something back to you, and you're saying, well, that's not what I said, or I said that in light of this. And that's within the same conversation of which you've been a part the whole time. So I think we need a list of like, here's what it means to interact charitably with people, especially Christians, loved ones, people of the family and the flock of Jesus Christ. Here's what it means to interact lovingly and kindly and to presume charity first, to be overtly gracious in the primary position. And I think it probably starts with, do not overreact and over-evaluate a single soundbite. That's really good advice.
Yeah. What about you, Jesse? What are you affirming or denying tonight?
What episode is this again?
438.
Okay, so everybody just timestamp this, mark this. This is 438. It's a weird episode for me because, Tony, you know, this is the first time that not all of me is on the podcast. In fact, about 1.6 ounces less of me is on the podcast. And I have to bring it up because the astute listeners already probably discerned that I sound a little bit low energy, and I am. My voice is a little bit hoarse, and it is. And this is where the affirmation actually comes in. And that is about 60 hours ago, I had my gallbladder removed. And I'm just affirming what amazing time it is to be alive, how good God's graciousness is in medicine so that you can go and have an organ removed from your body as outpatient surgery, come back home that same day. And, you know, everything is mostly right with the world. And I feel like I got hit by a bus, but I feel okay. And I'm so thankful for somebody who prayed for me and have been along with me in that journey. And Tony, you've been a part of that. You and I have been to some amazing doctor's appointments and tests and ER rooms, and it's all led to this. So I was just reminded going through all of this, and this is my first time having any kind of surgery. My wife has undergone extensive abdominal surgery several times. And in fact, the surgeon who operated on me was the one that actually saved her life through some very incredible abdominal surgery. And even though it is scary, the grace of God through these people in the healthcare profession who are incredibly kind and charitable toward me, understanding, empathetic, compassionate, cracking jokes, even as I got wheeled into the OR to make me feel more at ease. I am so incredibly thankful. So first, to the brothers and sisters out there who work in medicine, thank you. And I would say never underestimate what a single simple touch or single word of comfort or a single well-placed joke will do for a patient who's in desperate need of care and the kind of attention that puts them at ease. Like, seriously, don't underestimate that. And second, I'm just thankful for you all. Thank you for all that you do in serving others. And I'm certainly thankful for my surgeon who probably doesn't listen to the podcast, but if you are, Dr. Pham, as I've said before, you are Dr. Fantastic. So that's
Dr.
it.
Pham.
Dr. Pham.
Did you be like, I got you, fam?
I got you. Okay. Also, we need to establish some rules. First, no laughing. I
No
cannot
laughing.
laugh.
Yes.
That just hit me right in the feels. And two, I'm going to be like the NPR, like very chill. Everything is
Very
calm,
chill.
collected. This can't be the episode where I run through the wall because that would kill me right now. I just can't do that. I feel like I've already been through a wall.
A quick way to bust your stitches is to try to run through a wall.
So there you go. But you know, Tony, you interact with lots of doctors and surgeons, and right? Like that.
Yeah.
I'm just blessed again by that amazingness of the interaction, the small interactions, the smile, the being like, it's okay. I had so many people say, it's okay to be nervous, or yeah, you got a great team here. Don't worry about it. We're going to take good care of you. Like that stuff goes a really, really long way.
Yeah. I remember when I was working in gastroenterology as a supervisor, I was covering we had an exit desk. So you would go into the clinic, you'd have your doctor's appointment, and oftentimes the doctor would be bringing you out to schedule for some sort of follow-up test. And we were doing it. We did a test called an anorectal manometry, which just the name of it can tell you how just miserable of a test it probably is. And we came out. This woman came out, and we'll call her Jessica. That wasn't her real name. Jessica was registering with me, and I was getting her scheduled, and I was doing some screening questions and stuff. And she said, "Be honest with me. How's this test?" And I said, "Oh, it's rough. Like, don't be surprised. It's not pleasant." And she's like, "I've had a lot of people tell me that like these tests that I have to do are no big deal."
Right.
And they really are. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to lie to you. Like these are sometimes pretty like painful, just disturbing tests that have to be done to test certain parts of your body in the GI tract. And I'll never forget it because she looked at me and she said, I'd rather have someone confidently tell me that this is going to be miserable, but that I'm going to be okay, than to try to tell me that it's going to be totally fine. And I'll just never forget that. And it's just honesty, straightforwardness, and a tinge of humor. Like, the way I said it was like, oh yeah, this is going to be rough. Like just that little tiny bit of humor. And, I work in care patient experience, and all of the studies show that what a person remembers about their experience is very rarely the quality of their care. It's all of the stuff around it. And if they have a good customer experience or a good like interaction with their surgeon or with their provider or with the scheduler or with the security guard, whoever, if they have a good interaction with somebody, they are almost universally going to report that they believe the quality of care was good. Sometimes when it's actually not very good, patients will still report that the quality of care is very good or was very good even when it wasn't. And the converse is true. A lot of times we get these complaints and people are telling us that like the surgeons are awful and they screwed up and they hurt me. And we do the quality review and we're like, this is really, really good quality of care. And then we find out that like the surgeon was rude. A nurse will confirm that like the surgeon made a sort of smart comment to them or was short with the patient who was overly nervous and asking lots of questions. And you're absolutely right. So I totally affirm that sort of like backdoor affirmation there. If you're in medicine of any level, any kind, whether you're administrative, you're the janitor, whatever,
this is true.
Just take the time to be a human being and to just recognize that a person is coming to you. They're in some kind of crisis, and just those small human touches are often enough to change the whole direction of their experience. And the direction of their experience largely drives their outcomes. So yeah, this is why we are a top 50 healthcare podcast.
That's true. I forgot we're coming back into our own. This is our home turf. I'm reminded that I had some like really lovely scheduling people. And even that was really helpful. They got the phone and I would say to my wife, like, oh, so-and-so is so nice. And they're really helpful. They just walked me through everything that we need to do. And that was so reassuring. And what you said about truth telling is also, I think, a really good message there. So as I was sitting and laying down and preparing for the surgery in pre-op, my wife was with me. The nurse was fantastic. And she was going through everything. And she put in the IV At that point, you realize you're going to be getting a lot of things through the IV. And I'm just like, do what you need to do. And so she said to me, even though it's a short surgery, we need to give you something so that you have blood clots. And I remember like she pulls out like a giant syringe with a giant needle on it, and she's taking it out, she's filling it up, and she's getting it prepared. And I'm thinking, well, that makes sense. It's got to be that big because I guess they insert that whole thing into the IV line. And she goes, okay, so this is going to be in your side. And I think the look on my face was like, oh, I'm not prepared at all. Like apparently even Jen, my wife, was like, the look on your face, she could tell right away that you were not prepared
Yeah.
for her to put that in your side. And so she comes over, she's like, you didn't think that's what we were going to do, were you? And I was like, no. And she goes, also, you're up a slight build. So she goes, I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to hurt and it's going to burn.
Yeah.
And she was right. But she was just like, she didn't. She's like, still burning, and we're done. And it's just that way of knowing like, hey, I'd rather know what's coming. And then she made a little bit of light of that and we got through it. And honestly, it's just a reminder too, that the fact that our organs want to fail us and they do fail us, and sometimes for no particular reason whatsoever, isn't heaven going to be so great when we're completely perfected? And, Paul's saying, like we talked about last week, that all this stuff is, as we always say, like click, dragged, and dropped from the future into the present. That glorification has already happened in Christ. We're already seated with him. All of that's secured. All of our tickets have been paid and punched. We're ready to go. And when we are fully in our new bodies, resurrected, what a glorious day that will be. But not because it will happen on that day. It's already taken place, as it were.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking forward to that then, when no more shots will be necessary, no more anesthesia, no more waking up and being in a super weird state of mind. I already know, like they say the typical things like after 24 hours of anesthesia, don't like buy real estate, don't make any big decisions. I will say I came home and I think I called 2 people and don't remember that at all. I don't remember those conversations at all. One of them was my parents, your in-laws. So, I remember it vaguely, but I'm just realizing what a crazy experience it was. So I'm praising God that I'm on the other side of that, and that he orchestrated all the way, and just worshiping him and praying for healing, that this will shore up all the problems. So we'll see.
It's the closest Jesse's ever going to get to drunk dialing someone is making a phone call to his parents after surgery.
Yes. I know I did it, and I know that we talked. I think they were on a walk. I don't remember much besides that. I just want to let them know that we were home and that all was well. So
nice.
All right,
well,
so
Jesse,
let's do it,
I'm thankful for the surgeons who took good care of you. I'm thankful that you are persevering through tonight. We'll get going here, and I think what we need to do is we need to go back and read. We originally thought we were going to cover a large section of text, and then we broke it up into 2 episodes, and now we've broken into a third one. But I'm going to go back and read kind of the whole passage in question here, because I think there is something that comes up early on in the passage that we didn't spend a lot of time on, that I do think actually is relevant to what we're talking about tonight. So I'm going back to Colossians 2, verse 6, and we're going to read all the way through to the end of the chapter here. So it says, therefore, as you receive Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him, who is the head and rule and of all rule and authority. In him you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him, through faith in the powerful working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in details about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. So the element of this, excuse the pun, I didn't mean to do that, but the part of this
There
that
we
we
go.
didn't really talk about that we need to is this idea of the elemental spirits of the world. And this is we could go into all sorts of nerdy, just like Greek nerd out on this phrase and what it means and where it comes from. And actually, if you want all of that, just go to Matt Whitman's podcast, the 10-Minute Bible Hour, and he just went through this because this phrase is used in Galatians. I think he did like a 3 or 4 episode excursus on all of the different ways this is used. But broadly speaking, there's 3 different real strong possibilities for what this phrase means. The elemental spirits, the word translated as like stoichion or something like that. And it could mean sort of like the elemental principles. So like first principles, the baked in foundational philosophical premises of a philosophical system would be the stoichion. It could mean that. In this case, or in Galatians, if it means that, we're talking about like the fundamental principles of Judaism, like the fundamentals of the Old Testament law. The next thing it could mean, or one of the other things it could mean, would be like the actual elements of the world. So this comes from
Right.
Greek philosophy, and typically it's like earth, air, wind, and fire. But the basic stuff that the universe is made of is what would be in view there. So like the way we use the word elements when we're talking about either like elements in sort of like the mythological sense, or elements like the periodic table of elements, like the basic building blocks of reality. The final way that this could be used, and this is where the ESV translation goes, the elemental spirits, is sort of referring to like primeval, primordial spiritual beings. I don't think that's what it means though in this passage, and we can't get into all of it, but that usage was not attested to in this period of Greek and anywhere. So Paul would be using a phrase in 2 spots in his letters that no one else during the first century used in this way that we have any record of. So I don't know that I'm decided between the other two. I lean towards the actual elemental, like foundational building blocks of the universe. But the reason we have to talk about that is that in this passage here, now we've come back, he's now talking about that we've died to these elemental spirits of
Right.
the world. And because we've died to the elemental spirits of the world, all of what he said before about not passing judgment or not allowing people to pass judgment on us, not being, wrapped up in asceticism, worship of angels, all of that is because we have died. If we have died to the elemental spirits of the world, why would we submit to these other regulations that are related to asceticism? So we have to kind of grapple with what that means if we're going to make any sense of this passage.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think we spoke about that last week a little bit. This profound absurdity of trying to one up God. And if in fact Jesus, and however you interpret that, I think the critical thing here is this idea again that this wordplay that Paul uses, where he's drawing on this common kind of knowledge, zeitgeist at the time, of course, people being familiar with the Pax Romana. And when generals were rewarded in the Pax Romana, being given like a parade or a military triumph, some kind of demonstrative display of victory parade. And here's Christ being put up as the one who has made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over all of them by the cross. So I think I think maybe like you're saying, like, could it be part of these elemental spirits? Sure. Is it more than that? I would say yes. And so because it's more than that, because they're now meaningless and trivial things, why would you waste your time majoring in the minors?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get into the passage proper. We're gonna focus on 16 following here. So Paul here is now saying, because of everything that we said before, right? Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you. So this is basically like everything coming prior in the letter, but immediately prior, it's talking about because you're not taken captive by these vain philosophies, because you're no longer being
Right.
being taken captive according to these elemental spirits, because the record of debt has been nailed to the cross, because you have been baptized in Christ, and that because your flesh has been put off in his circum. All of those things we've talked about in the last couple of weeks. Because of all that, Now we are in this place where we no longer allowed to let anyone pass judgment on us. And this is where I think we need to be a little more forceful than sometimes I think people are. In this case, it's like, let that roll off of you. Don't worry about it if people pass judgment on you. I actually think it's more forceful than that. Do not let people pass judgment on you. So if people are passing judgment on you, you need to like vocally oppose that. And he says this specifically not to pass judgment in questions of food or drink, regards to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath, or I think a better translation or is of Sabbaths. We can talk about that. And the reason he says that we do this is because these are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So
Right.
all of these things he's talking about, all of these things that are connected to the Old Testament law, right? New moons, festivals, Sabbaths, regulations on food or drink, in this first part, and then coming up, other things like asceticism, worshiping angels, all of these other things that are not related to Judaism, that are outside of that. All of these things, the Old Testament law is this shadow that is the shadow of Christ to come. Baptism, going back to our baptism circumcision discussion last week, both of those things are shadows. They're just shadows in different directions, right? One of them is a shadow that we see anticipating Christ. And then baptism is, in a sense, a shadow that we see following Christ. It's still a visible image that represents a reality, but is not the reality itself. So we have to kind of grapple with that dynamic in this passage, that substance shadow dynamic. And if we don't get that right, we're not really gonna understand why things like festivals, new moons, and Sabbaths come up, and then why that sort of leads into a discussion about like asceticism and other extra Judaic kinds of practices that had crept probably into the church, but then especially in this false teaching that Paul is refuting here.
That is the critical point. And I'm glad you brought that up, because what we need to evaluate, I think, is whether or not that's what's happening here when we experience it. So another way to say this might be to say, don't be judged by legalists. What we need to understand is if someone is judging us by a legal standard, and for what purpose. So all the things you just spoke about, these are all issues that touch on the old covenant. In Moses' law, God makes very clear that there are stipulations, and you can follow up on those. Like you said, there's the Leviticus 11, that's the eating and drinking. Leviticus 23 of the religious festivals. Numbers 10, that's the new moon celebration. Sabbath day, Leviticus 23. So here's what's wild, though. In each of their different ways, all of those things were a means for believers to show their devotion to independence on their rescuer God.
Right.
It proved that they were different from like their pagan neighbors. And the thing is, you and I have gone on record, I think, before of saying, like, in some ways, I want people to interpret this charitably as well, is that we've said like those laws were irrelevant. Sometimes there's this argument where God gives all these dietary restrictions. He's trying to bring about like a more holy health code, as it were. But really what he's trying to establish is these people are different. They are separated and apart. I've marked them for myself. And so what Paul is saying here is now Jesus does all of that remarking in a way. Jesus brings all of that together in a more profound, more holy, more beautiful way, that this is God coming close. This is God condescending. It's in the form of the one who is truly God and truly man. So the question now becomes, if these things are not necessary by way of proving essentially that belongingness, that there is this devotion, dependence on God is now differentiated from the Old Testament law in a way that is, again, distinct, then by nature of that, if people are judging you by that false standard, the standard that's no longer necessary or is completely outmoded, then you should confront that judgment, right? I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's not just enough to be like, oh, that's silly, but to actually have a conversation about that very thing. Why is it that you're bringing that kind of judgment? I think like this is something that probably at least goes by me, because you can imagine for the people in Colossae receiving this letter from somebody they will never meet, and Paul writing to people he knows he will never go to or actually visit in person, that there's a lot of drama in this. He's really coming against all of this stuff that's saying, no, listen, here's what a follower of Jesus does. They do all these things. They are circumcised. They follow all these dietary restrictions. He's pushing against that to get to the heart of the matter, which is, if you have been set free by Christ, and you have been set free indeed. This is not a freedom and a liberty to live like without compulsion, without being constrained by the love of Christ, but it's a higher and new standard, which desires to know how much God loves us and asks that we'd have the strength to love him back. And in so doing, that we fulfill the law that's written on our hearts, not the one that we find written on the tablets of stone anymore. So it is a really, really big deal. And I think that this in some ways is why it provoked like Luther to say some wild things when it came to like, isn't Luther the poster child for this in a way?
Yeah.
And not like in a bad way, almost like, him saying, to somebody, if somebody tells me I can't drink, I'm going to drink a pint of beer in their face to the glory of God. It's him pushing. I'm hoping he's having that conversation, but he's pushing. I mean, he's dead, but he's pushing against that very mode of thinking, which says like, I could just bring these standards against somebody like as a hammer, as a sledgehammer to destroy them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's worth a little minor excursus when we talk about the Sabbath here, because this passage often gets sort of touted out there as, there is a quadrant of Reformed theology that can be a little bit overzealous with Sabbath regulation.
That's true.
Right. But then there's also, I think, a much wider swath of Reformed Christianity that has abandoned any meaningful sense that the Sabbath is sanctified or set apart.
That's also
and
true.
that latter group tends to use this passage to refute the other group. And in reality, both of those groups are in a form of error. Right. So in this passage, the word for Sabbath is actually plural.
Right.
So it's probably best translated as not as the Sabbath, as in the 1 in 7 Lord's Day, or 1 in 7, the first day Sabbath or seventh day Sabbath or whatever. This is probably better interpreted as referring to the high Sabbaths. So there was the regular weekly Sabbath that happened every week. And then in association with certain festivals and certain new moon celebrations, there was this high Sabbath that would occur on top of a regular Sabbath, right? So this really is tied to the Jewish festival sequence, not necessarily the daily, weekly routine of the Sabbath.
Right.
And so when we talk about the Lord's Day as the Christian Sabbath, and we talk about the Lord I don't have the question in front of me, but in the Westminster Shorter Catechism and then the larger Catechism gives a little bit of a longer answer. We talk about the fact that the Sabbath is, in the Old Covenant, the Sabbath is this is the seventh day, right? And then the Lord changed that in the New Covenant to be the first day, which is associated with the resurrection of Christ. And there's a whole complex of exegetical theological support for that. But we're not saying that the Sabbath is not relevant, right?
Right.
As Reformed Christians, we affirm that the Ten Commandments are the summary of the moral law, which does not perish. It does not go away. It did not change. It did not become obsolete with Christ. The moral law is in effect as it always has been, and that includes the fourth commandment just as much as it includes the prohibitions against murder or adultery or lying or stealing, right? So we can't read that word here to mean that we no longer have to celebrate the Sabbath. And the reason for that is because the Sabbath as a celebration in the Old Covenant, although it is the moral law, the Sabbath has a moral law component to it. It has a ceremonial element built into it. And that's the fact that it is on the seventh day. That's what changes the ceremonial element of it. But that's because of what it points to. The seventh day Sabbath points to the fact that there was a rest coming. Right? There was a rest coming in the person of Christ. And so the Sabbath, the ceremonial element has changed because now that Christ has come, the Sabbath is celebrated in a different sense and in a different way and on a different day. And that's central here because it is the substance that we're talking about. So all of those festivals, they point to Christ. And I think R. Scott Clark makes a pretty good argument that the Lord's Supper is not just a continuation or a modification of the Passover meal. It's actually a modification and it's a reiteration or recapitulation of all of the festivals, the whole festival cycle. Yep. So baptism is the recapitulation of circumcision as sort of the initiatory sign. And then the Lord's Supper is a recapitulation of the celebration sign, which in the Old Covenant was all of the festivals, all of the new moons, all of the Sabbaths, the weekly Sabbath, but then all of the high Sabbaths as well. So I think in this passage, we have to get our head around the fact that all of that stuff is pointing to Christ. And because all of that is pointing to Christ, we should not return to it. There is some movements within modern Christianity, and I'm not talking about Messianic Christianity. That's a different thing, and I think there are some problems there. There's some challenges, and I think sometimes some squirrely theology involved in Messianic Christianity. which Messianic Christianity typically it means it's a person who is essentially Jewish and then accepts Jesus as Messiah, but they retain most of their Jewishness, including the celebration of various festivals and Sabbaths and things. I think there's problems there, but that's not what I'm talking about. There's a movement within Gentile Christianity in some sectors, particularly dispensationalists, to also celebrate the Old Testament festivals and to try to like appropriate them into Christianity. And I think that's fundamentally misguided because it's not, and it's funny because this is where this comes up is I might say that someone, they're going to point to this and say, well, don't pass judgment on me regarding these festivals. I have the freedom to do that. Well, the problem is that you have the freedom to do that only if Christ is not the substance.
Right.
If Christ is the substance, then you're actually diminishing him by celebrating the shadow
Right.
as though the substance hasn't come. So I think we have to lock that in. And then once we've locked that in and realize we have that substance, that's where everything from the rest of this passage flows from, is that we have the substance of Christ. We have the substance which belongs to Christ. So we no longer need any of these other kinds of things, whether it's the Old Testament rituals or whether it's these other more Gentile oriented things that are coming up later. We no longer need those because Christ is enough for us.
Yeah, that's well said. I mean, there's plenty of times where the Holy Spirit has been so kind in the revealed will of God to give us in the Gospels examples of this very kind of interaction to see, I think, presented for us what it looks like to not be judged by legalists. And among the best and the most pithy, I think, is in the end of Mark chapter 2 on exactly that topic. You have the disciples, they're passing through grain fields on the Sabbath day. And as they're doing that, they're picking those heads of grain. And the Pharisees, obviously out to set a trap, they're just, creepers stalking everybody. And they say to Jesus, they pull him aside and say, look, what's going on here? Why are they doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath? And then, of course, Jesus goes on and talk about, I love how he says, like, did you not read what David did? Like with the holy bread? And then the whole point of this, though, it comes in this mic drop moment where Jesus says to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So the question is, who is Lord of all these things? Who is the substance over all of the shadows? It is Jesus. And you're right, I think, to push us in the direction that says, where the substance has made himself present, we do not need to celebrate or be distracted by the shadow anymore. And I think that's what Paul's after here. He's saying, listen, anybody that wants to try to pull you back into that, even if they're well-intentioned, you ought to fight against it. You got to push against that because what they're doing is they're pushing you in a direction that's going to force you into error. And the error could be small or it could be slight, but it will be magnified over time if you get caught up in doing something merely because you think the shadow itself is going to prove the substance. So it is worth fighting against rather than being passive.
Yeah. And this is an analogy that I'm shamelessly stealing from Mike Horton, but essentially what we have going on here is that the Old Testament law, the ceremonial law particularly, but in many ways the judicial or the penal law, civil law, it is the trailer to the movie and Christ is the movie, right? I remember, I guess it's probably been longer than I would like to admit, but I remember when Avengers Endgame was coming out. And it was like the pinnacle culmination of like a decade worth of movies. And I think Endgame was the direct sequel to like 30 different movies or something crazy like that. I watched the trailer for Endgame probably 100 times before the movie came out. I'm going to give you a guess how many times I've watched the trailer since Endgame came out.
Right.
0, right?
Right.
And it's because I don't need to watch the trailer anymore. Right. I mean, I shouldn't say that. Like there's been some times I've gone back and looked at the trailer just because they lie to you in the trailer. So it's kind of fun to go back and see all the things they included that weren't actually the movie. But I never went back to the trailer to watch it as a trailer. Like
or
you
the real
can't,
McCoy.
Right. You can't get excited about a trailer
right
in and of itself for what it is once the movie has come out. It just doesn't work that way. And I think that's what we're doing if we go back to the festivals. Right. It's looking at you're going like, well, I could just watch Endgame, but instead I'm going to like go on YouTube on this little screen and I'm going to watch the trailer. I'm going to watch this 5-minute trailer.
Like a video about it, right? Like talk about a movie that you really want to see that's available.
Right. And I think this is important for us because we have to get this principle right. And then now when we go into verse 18 and following, it's almost like a foregone conclusion that we don't need to do these other things, that we don't need to be bound by these other things. Because if this set of rituals, this set of ceremonial laws and rites, rites, that came from God, right? They're good intrinsically
Yes,
because they came from
exactly.
God. They're good.
Yeah.
They served a purpose. They were holy. They were righteous. They were beneficial to the people. If those things are the shadow and we no longer need them because we have the substance, then all this other nonsense, this other man-made nonsense, this asceticism, this worshiping angels, this going on in details about visions, this being puffed up with reason by our sensuous minds, all of that is totally vain, even more than the vanity of the Old Testament celebrations would be for us. It's not only is it not necessary, it's made up and unprofitable. And that's what it says here is that when you are allowing someone to insist on these things for you, right? If I was to allow someone to insist on asceticism for me, that would disqualify me. I think that's
Right.
that's a phrase we need to think about a little bit,
Yeah, I agree.
right? It disqualifies me, and this is talking about Paul uses this disqualification language when he's talking about the life of a Christian. He's talking about someone who has failed to finish the race well.
Right.
Like it's a serious statement. It's an apostasy kind of warning, right?
Right.
You can be disqualified as a Christian if you allow yourself to be forced into an ungodly asceticism or to be forced into the worship of angels, or I would say the worship of saints. Obviously, Paul didn't have Roman Catholicism in mind here because Roman Catholicism didn't exist in Paul's day, right? I think the concept that people would be worshiping deceased saints probably was like beyond Paul's imagination, but people were worshiping angels in his day, right? So when we have people that insist on these things and we allow them to constrain our religion, our dedication to Christ by these things, we run the risk, if not all out having happened, we run the risk of being disqualified as a Christian. Like that's a serious thing to think about.
Right.
And that's what he's saying here, because in verse 19, he says, when you do all these things, you are in a state of not holding fast to the head, for whom all the whole
Right.
body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with the growth that is from God. When you do these things, for whatever reason, whether it's because some external force is constraining you or trying to constrain you and you allow them to, or whether you've imposed these things on yourself, what you've done is you've disconnected yourself from Christ. You've disconnected yourself from the substance by relying on something that is in itself not the substance. Even if it's a shadow that points to the substance, if you're relying on that shadow to the exclusion of the substance, you've lost the whole thing. They've become
Right.
empty and vain. They've become deceitful. They've become empty philosophies that were not to be held captive to. That is the key to this passage. And it's the whole theme of the letter. Christ is enough. Jesus is sufficient. If we allow ourselves to be constrained to, or we convince ourselves that we need these other things apart from Christ, which is the root of the false teaching in Colossae, then we have lost, not only are we being constrained by these, we've lost Christ. We've lost the head. We're no longer holding fast to him. That is really, really scary, but it's also really, really important.
Yeah, don't get disqualified. I mean, Paul is very, very clear about that. And by invoking all these things, whether it's those mystical ideas or the laws we were just talking about, it's important to remember, and I think you hit on this well, that though God established these things, even all those things were never intended to prevent an impure life. But the human heart is just too persistently rebellious to be tamed by food or some kind of rules and regulations. And so there was something that was needed that was far more radical. And those laws, even those mystical ideas, they could never do more than just be identifying marks for belonging to God's community. And what we have here is that clearly the Pharisees, others in the day, took it too far, but we are tempted to take it too far all the time in the same way.
Yeah.
But Jesus liberates everyone from those intolerable and impossible burdens. And there's a lot of freedom in there, which is what Paul moves into next. But it's worth us, like you said, kind of pausing just for a second to understand that we all want to enact some kind of legalism, because legalism at the end of the day, even of our own lives, makes us feel that we've achieved something. But here is like the rub. And you and I have also spoken about this. This also can lead us very quickly into some kind of heretical kind of rubric, because we've said before that the best way to kind of define a heresy is any kind of error that separates you from Christ. And so when you start trusting in these things in some kind of more profound way, if you start using them in a way that even gives you greater confidence in your closeness or communion with Christ, your understanding of who he is, or your relationship with him, then what you are doing is you have replaced him. And that is a problem of kind of epic proportions. And I think it's why Paul is like, doesn't just mince words here. It's why many of the theologians, many of the saints that have gone before us, have been so staunch in their defense against legalistic thinking. Because it's not just about saying, well, in the New Testament realm, Christ has set us free, and because we are free, we can do whatever we want. It's not that at all. It's that celebrating. To be free in Christ is to celebrate. You see, this is too much. You get me excited. In Christ, when we say we are free, what we're saying is he is enough. We're celebrating that without taking away the underpinnings and the kind of constraining that when Paul says that God's love would constrain us. It's that love that doesn't replace the law, but empowers it for the kind of right living in freedom so that we are in harmonious relationship with Christ, even as we find ourselves obeying the law, again, not out of some kind of meritorious reward or some kind of trying to pull ourselves up by our spiritual bootstraps, but merely because Christ brings all things into consummate harmony when he restores, when he comes and fulfills the law in our lives. And again, doesn't just grant us amnesty, but puts credit into our account for that kind of righteous, active, and passive obedience, which he secures on our behalf. It's totally alien, and that's the way it ought to be, because something more radical was needed. The kind that comes from within, the kind of self-proclaimed righteousness, the one that says like, no, I want to sit in the shadow. That's the one we always have to watch out for, because even as we're well-intentioned, it can breed a path. That's a weird way of mixing so many metaphors. You don't breed paths. It can establish a path that leads right into kind of heretical territory.
Yeah. And then, I would be a little bit remiss to mention the Piper article and then not, or the Piper sermon and then not offer a little bit of a, correction, warning, whatever. One of the issues that I think people are rightly pointing out, and there are some people now who are taking time to find the whole sermon, and I went back and listened to the whole sermon. I mentioned there's some issues. One of the issues with the Piper sermon I mentioned earlier is that he essentially preaches the context of the sermon, and this will all come back around to what I'm about to say. The context of the lecture he's giving is it's a preaching seminar. And he's basically teaching that we should preach the warning passages, and he goes about explaining how he preaches the warning passages to congregations that he's preaching for. And he essentially leaves the congregation with a warning. And the problem with that is that I don't know that matches the Reformed understanding of this. I think that would be a worthy debate to discuss. But it doesn't match the biblical way that the warning passages are employed. Right? In Hebrews, the most stark, stunning warning passage is Hebrews 6. And he goes through this passage, and it's scary language. And as a Christian, it's kind of terrifying, and it's supposed to be a little bit terrifying, and it's supposed to be a genuine warning. And then he immediately follows up with, but we are convinced of better things about you. Right? So the biblical model is that there's a warning against apostasy or a warning against disqualification. And it is always, or nearly always, immediately followed up with some sort of encouragement coming from the promises of Christ. And that's what we see happen here. And you don't necessarily catch this in the language of the ESV, but it says here in verse 20, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, if you are still alive in the world, or why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations, right? That first word, if, is probably better translated as since. Right? It's not a conditional clause. He's not saying like, like if you were this and maybe you aren't, then why is this the case? Right. Like, yeah, I might say to Jesse, like, if you're going to the store, could you buy me a loaf of bread? And that would be different than if I said, since you're going to the store, can you buy me a loaf of bread? Right. The former is what's called a first class conditional. The latter is a second class conditional. Like it's a conditional, but it's a rhetorical conditional.
Right.
In this case, this is that second class. It's not saying if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, and then in parentheses, and maybe you didn't. That's not what this is saying. It's saying, since with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? This is the same thing that he says, or the same response he makes in Romans when his sort of like imaginary interlocutor, who probably was not all that imaginary, is saying like, well, Paul says that we should sin that grace may abound. He says, well, no, like if you've died to Christ, then how, like it's insane to think that if you've died to Christ or died in Christ, that you would continue in sin. Like that just is a nonsense situation. He's making the same argument here. And that's not to say that the Colossian believers were not doing this. They obviously were starting to submit themselves to some of these regulations, or Paul would not have had to write this letter, right? There was obviously a real risk that the Colossian believers were starting to slip into these patterns or had slipped into these patterns, or the letter is unnecessary. This is where, as Christians, we need to call each other to live out our calling, to walk in the manner worthy of the gospel, not because it determines whether or not we're Christians, but because we are Christ.
Right.
Because we with Christ died to the elemental spirits of the world, then we no longer need to submit to these regulations. It's nonsense for us to submit to the regulations. It's incoherent, it's illogical, it's insanity for us to submit to regulations like do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, right? And we do these things. Again, this is going back to what he said, like we disqualify ourselves if we allow ourselves to be bound by asceticism and worship of angels from some external source. And so because we have died with Christ, we don't need to do that. It's insane for us to do that. So let's do what those who have died with Christ do. And that's not to say like we have a free blank check to do whatever we want. We have a blank check to obey God's moral law, which sometimes does mean do not taste, do not touch, right? There are restrictions on what we do. I mean, not like taste. Like I don't think there's things we shouldn't eat, but like there are restrictions on what we consume and what we partake in that are rooted in the moral law that we are obligated to follow. Right. I'm not allowed to like abuse heroin just because I've died with Christ, so I can do whatever I want. That's not the point here. The point is that we are free to obey the law in the spirit, and we are free not to be bound by anything outside of God's moral law, outside of what he has commanded his people to do or forbidden his people to do. We're free to engage in creation and in enjoying the world, enjoying the good things that God has put in this world, without being bound to abstain from those things, right? And again, Paul doesn't have Roman Catholicism in view here because Roman Catholicism didn't exist. But we see in Roman Catholicism, there are all sorts of things, right? Priests aren't allowed to marry. And even the regular person, it's seen as a second-class condition to be a person who marries and enjoys sexual relations with their spouse. That's seen as like a second class condition or a second class kind of Catholic. Like the real godly people, they're the monks and the priests and the nuns who don't do that dirty stuff that, you know, is necessary for the propagation of human species. That is absolutely ungodly and opposed to Scripture, just straight out. This is why the reformers, even though it was a big challenge for them, like it was a really big mindset shift and they really struggled with this. This is why the reformers to a man took wives and had children and started families, because it is part of what it means to be a human, is to be in that kind of a context. That's not to say every person who doesn't have children or can't have children or even chooses not to, depending on the reasoning behind it, is somehow deficient. But the ordinary arrangement for humankind is to be married and create children. Like that's the way that God intended the human species to work. So when we have things that start to pull us away from that, and whether it's that or other elements, we are not bound by those things, and we cannot be bound by those things. If we are bound by those things, if we allow ourselves to be bound by those things, that is potentially an indication that we are not truly united to Christ, because we do not experience the freedom that is ours in Christ. So it's not that participating in these things or refusing to be bound somehow unites us to Christ, but it may be a genuine indicator that we need to think about, that maybe we don't fully have that freedom in Christ that we should.
Right. It's as if Paul is saying to us and to the church here in Colossae, listen, if you think that your obsessive religiosity is going to achieve anything, it won't. It never works. It doesn't work. And more than that, Christ has come to set you free, to have the kind of obedience that doesn't keep track, doesn't keep record, that out of loving kindness and devotion automatically impounds and brings all of those things into relationship, because that's exactly what loving relationship does by its very nature. So in some ways, it's no different than like what we said before, this idea that the law, all of this stuff, it was made to demonstrate and exemplify God's glory. But the law was made for man and not man for the law. And so, like we said before, the only true man is the Christian, because that's the one who's not a slave to sin anymore, but is a slave to Christ. And if Christ is the one who is the truly most free human being who ever lived, because it's not to say there are no boundaries anymore, but the boundaries perfectly align with the way that we are created to live. And then we can somehow, by the power of God, fall and find ourselves within those appropriate boundaries. That is life as it was meant to live. What's more free than that?
Yeah.
So I'm totally with you. I think that there's so much here for us to continue, like we should meditate and chew on, because I think what we've at the very least learned today is three things in our conversation. The first is that we have to understand all of these three devastating, I think, critiques that Paul sets for legalism. One, it's totally incompatible with the grace that Christ brings. Two, it's merely worldliness concealed beneath the guise of religious activity. And three, it's singularly useless at changing lives and communities. All those things are true. They will never cease to be true. And so if you want the real thing is the God-man, the one who comes and crushes the serpent's head, the one that comes in power, the ones that are first brother, the one who has risen from the dead and will rise us as our first brother. He is the real deal. And that's the one that Paul will just keep leading us to over and over and over again in this beautiful letter.
Yeah. Jesse, I know that usually we have a whole retinue of things to say and things to cover, but I want to leave it kind of there. I don't want to cover over this with all the calls to action that we usually do. I think that's a super good summary, and it's super important to remember, because that is the last point of this passage, is not just that, like, you shouldn't be bound to these things. These things don't help you. What helps you is the union with Christ, that those things, the Sabbath, the new moons, the festivals, the union with Christ that those things pointed to, that is what brings about change. That's right. Jesse, I'm going to leave us with that. And until next time, honor everyone.
Love the brotherhood.
What if I'm far from home? Oh, brother, I would hear you call. What if I lose it all? Oh, sister, I would help you out. If the sky comes falling down for you, there's nothing in this world I wouldn't